What do you picture when you imagine a researcher? This could depend on your past experiences or your major. If you're in the sciences, maybe you imagine a lab with a principal investigator leading different researchers, postdocs, undergraduate researchers, a whole group to get out the truth. If you're in the social sciences, maybe you imagine a solitary researcher or a team of researchers going out into the field and talking to people. And if you're in the humanities, I bet you might have a romantic imagination about the solitary researcher up in that garret, in that attic with the candle and trying to write the end of that manuscript. Okay, maybe that one sounds a little too out of date, but that's partially how we imagine research in the humanities. We think about there's going to be that one researcher going to the archive, looking at the text, getting those insights, writing about them, and going through what's called single author publications. And with digital humanities, that just won't work. We need collaboration because, on a practical matter, no one has all the skills needed for most digital projects. You often need the person who has the background in the text or the theory or whatever. You need the programmer. You need someone to do the data analytics. So you need a lot of different people working together, and you have a whole project management cycle. And that's part of what we're thinking about this week. When you look at Jeffrey Rockwell's paper, he's making arguments along those lines. He's saying we had this idea, and he goes back to Rene Descartes, the guy who does the cogito, I think, therefore I am, that's this idea of I'm this solitary mind in the cosmos, and that has gone into our view of humanities research. And he points out, no, we need collaborative research. So the context of that paper was a conference. It was a conference for a group called Implementing New Knowledge Environments. And the conference was called Open Social Scholarship. A lot of words there. I want to unpack that. Open social scholarship. You'll hear some values we've been talking about all term so far. So open, we're thinking about how can these be open access? How can we make it where our insights are shared with others? How do we keep things from being behind a paywall? That's very important for any sort of researcher who has public funding, whether that person works for like a public land grant university, or that person has a National Science Foundation grant or a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, which is what we use a lot in digital humanities. Because if public tax dollars have already gone to any of my research, I have a professional obligation to share it widely. But academic publications are hidden behind paywalls. Libraries have to buy them. And so that's the idea of open. How can our tools be open? Voyant and Spiral are both open. We aren't paying for anything. Notice that there's no payments happening. There's nothing being added where you have to buy books and anything like that. That's where open is happening in this class. So open in the sense of we need the tools to be open. Then open in the sense of I need my research available to others. Notice the article you're reading this week. You don't have to go to the library. It's on a website because they were modeling that. So that's the idea of open. Then there's social. How do we work together on one end? How do we collaborate on research? So there's social in that sense among researchers, among colleagues, and social in the sense of how do we share our research with others and collaborate beyond the academy. So at the same conference with Jeffrey Rockwell, I was presenting on how to help faculty be public scholars, and not in the sense of the public intellectual who gives to the world, but the community engaged researcher who partners with the local community. So that's part of what's going on there with open social scholarship. We're trying to look for how do we collaborate together with the community and with other colleagues, and how do we share our insights publicly. And Spiral is a great tool to model that. Here's why. One, it's open in the sense of you don't have to pay anything. You just put in a link. And what's also great about that, and Rockwell talks about this, it's open in a sense of accessibility, because when you use other tools, you have to have all this knowledge of how to use them. So for example, those of you in finance, you will at some point probably use Wolfram Mathematica. It takes lots of knowledge, lots of a learning curve there. Those of you in the physical sciences, you may use Jupyter notebooks. Computer scientists may too. And that works similar to Spiral, but you have to know how to use it. Voyant does something similar. It's an easier version of detectual analysis than using RStudio, because RStudio gets to know the coding language R, and with Voyant, you can more play with it. So that's the way it's open in the sense that people have access to it. But Spiral is also great with this idea of collaboration while researching. We're not going to do that directly in this class. You're going to have a solitary Spiral notebook, but the way it works is you could share that with anyone. You could give that link to someone and you could edit it together. So it can be this space of inquiry. It can be this sort of almost digital lab environment where you run code, your colleague comes in and says, oh, what if we do this code differently? Run it, then you write about it. So this idea of collaborating together, and that's how notebooks tend to work, is where you can collaborate together on it, run code, do your analysis, explain it. But the great thing is, because it has these blocks where you run your code and then you explain what's happening with your analysis, that makes it where it's not just social in the sense of how do we collaborate if you and I are working on a project together, but how do we share it with others? So this one's an example. When you get to your final project, you could sometimes say, when you answer my question, which one do I analyze my research question with, and which one do I share my research materials with? Spiral could be the answer to both. And part of that is thanks to this idea of literate programming. And that comes out of computer science research, and it's used a lot of those other notebooks. I mentioned Jupyter notebooks. These are digital notebooks where you can have coding blocks and text blocks. And Wolfram Mathematica has one. For those of you in the finance, you'll probably use something like that later on. So this idea of literate programming, here's what that means. We have this tendency when we do in-store programming to do the code and maybe leave it. Maybe you'll annotate it. If you're using a coding environment where you do the 2 forward slashes, you can say, what does that do? That can be very important when you're collaborating, just to literally say, if you have a code block, note what it's doing. And you can also use that to annotate where certain code blocks start. If you have a long thing of, even like in web development, like you have a long thing of Cascade style script, you can say, okay, this script is doing X, Y, and Z. And that's great for collaborating. So it's not just annotating, you can also do ways where you explain it. And there's this idea in literate programming of going from the coding language to the natural language. So I'm speaking in a natural language right now, the language that organically develops among human persons rather than the ones that we've made for machines to be able to interpret. And so what you do there is you'll have your code, maybe annotate it, and then you can say in the text block, here's what the code does. And that can be a great process for learning how to code. That can be a great process for something called paired programming, which if any of you go on to computer science, then it's common in the field where maybe a senior developer will lead and say, here's where we're going, I need you to do this. And the junior developer will actually be typing it and looking at the ground level with it. And so that's sort of the origins of literate programming. Spiral takes it a step further. It's not just going from here's a code block and here's my text block with natural language explaining what's going on in that code block. It's also here's my text block where I do analysis. So the idea of literate programming from computer scientists leads to something new for digital humanists, because we have the code block and then we do our textual analysis. We actually write about it. We say, why are we doing this? We give our analytical, critical thinking in there, saying, what do we see from this? Where do we go from here? So it's kind of a way where digital humanities, remember, it borrows from computer science some ideas, but aligns it with humanities' needs, because the research needs of different disciplines are different. So continue to think about these kind of things throughout the term of what tool will work for my project. So you want to think about what's something you care about that you want to research for your final project. And you can think about what tool I use to analyze that and what tool do I use to share that with others. And Spiral can be an example of both.